tenemos un ponente de excepción. Para mí es un auténtico honor y yo creo que para todos un privilegio contar con la presencia hoy aquí del profesor Kilborn, profesor de Derecho Mercantil de la Facultad de Derecho John Marshall de Chicago. Ha venido de Chicago hasta aquí, así que se lo agradecemos profundamente. Tenemos que decir que es uno de los especialistas más destacados en insolvencia de persona natural. Cualquier persona que haya trabajado sobre insolvencia de persona física, de consumidores o de empresarios, pues obviamente tiene que citar los trabajos del profesor Kilborn, que tiene una calidad extraordinaria. Ha escrito innumerables trabajos, insisto, de muy buena calidad. Es la persona de referencia y sobre todo en estudio del derecho comparado en materia de insolvencia de persona natural. Conoce prácticamente todos los sistemas, lo que le ha permitido asesorar a muchos gobiernos y participar, el director del informe del Banco Mundial sobre insolvencia de persona natural, que yo desde luego recomiendo su lectura porque es absolutamente extraordinario. Para nosotros ya digo que es un auténtico lujo contar con él aquí. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Jason, for coming. You can start who you want.
Well, muchas gracias to you as well. I begin very intentionally with the words muchas gracias because yesterday in my country we celebrated a national holiday called Thanksgiving. And I was yesterday and am today very thankful to be able to come here and present to you on a topic about which I am very passionate. And my passion primarily is driven toward the beating hearts of individuals in business in Europe. It's really the individual people about whom I care most and whom these insolvency discussions will impact most forcefully. As we saw in André's presentation, very frequently the concentration of insolvency discussion is on businesses, large corporations and restructuring their operations. And I enjoy having those conversations also, but very frequently conversations like this sort of presume that small and medium-sized enterprises can use those same sorts of structures to achieve some sort of relief, when in fact experience for many, many years has indicated small to medium-sized enterprises really are unable, for a variety of reasons, to take advantage of restructuring systems. So what really small to medium-sized enterprises need is frankly the same thing that millions and millions of consumers need, and that's simply relief. We need a fresh start. We need to be renewed and reinvigorated. Europe and indeed the rest of the world need to mobilize the productive energies that we all have within us. Europe is full of very creative, very talented, very hardworking people, and an insolvency system is an absolutely essential structure to re-enliven that activity that has been put down by a long-standing dedication to the rights of creditors to have what's theirs. And for years, I've pursued a sort of academic discussion of, well, how do we define what ought to be theirs in the sense of something that belongs to creditors, and how do we refocus perhaps on what ought to belong to all of us? Are we really prepared to allow creditors to prevent all of society from enjoying the benefits of the creative, productive, entrepreneurial energies of these people? Or shouldn't we look more closely at what, in my view, is the most important part, the most commendable part of the Commission's proposal, and that is the portion on discharge. I am extremely excited to be talking about this here, and I really commend the Commission for including the personal discharge provisions within a discussion of restructuring. I think it's fantastic that finally the Commission has risen up and said we need to bring some harmony to what is now the cacophony of widely varying approaches to allowing individuals, again, to be remobilized and reinvigorated, not for the benefit necessarily of a few creditors, but for all of us, for all of European society, and indeed for the entire world. We are all in this together, and when I say we, I mean we individuals with beating hearts. I care about restructuring large business because large business helps all of us to achieve our potential. But it really is our potential on which the focus ought to be, in my view. So I will focus on our potential. How does the proposed directive deal with reinvigorating the energies of individuals? And in particular, I'll do as most academics do and criticize things, bearing in mind that this is what I hope will be constructive criticism. It sounds from André's presentation as though this really is an ongoing conversation. And I really hope that the Parliament, and even if this thing gets passed later, ultimately other people who are in charge of following and enforcing the directive can continue to think about the constructive criticisms that I'll offer today from what the program describes as an international perspective, and I hope I can honestly bring this international perspective. What I don't want to see happen here is what frankly is happening in India right now. India, quite famously, has just adopted a new insolvency structure. Lots of folks around the world are talking about it, and in the Indian process, the entire concentration was on restructuring for large business entities. And there certainly is some consideration now of reinvigorating small entrepreneurs, maybe individuals as well, but this is at best an afterthought. And we should not be an afterthought. Individuals should be at the forefront of this discussion, and I hope to sort of at least push the individual perspective forward by pointing out 3 areas of concern that I have about the proposal, at least as it's drafted, from, again, an international perspective. The 3 points I'll mention today first are access. How does one get into this process, and how does the proposal control the way in which member states might respond to a rule that requires individuals to be given access to this system? What I want to suggest is if you build a hospital and lock the door, it will not be effective as a hospital for treating sick people. And I'm afraid that the proposal allows fairly easily for member states to build large, elaborate hospitals and then lock the door. Second, then, I'll take a look at this repayment idea. How much should we allow member states to demand that individuals work to repay their creditors? Once again, really commend the Commission on solidly coming down against the idea of interminable debt slavery, essentially, for individual cycle of never being able to escape from their debts. That's wonderful. But the difference between that and the reality of people who, as André pointed out, are unable even to pay a small portion of their debts, the reality is those things are not different. I'm either going to be allowed into the hospital to be treated, or I can't get into the hospital. And whether my sickness is terminal, or whether I could in fact be cured if only I were given access to a reasonable cure, I still can't be cured if I can't get in and I can't do what is required of me to be cured. So my second concerns will be what is required to be cured, and might we expect that member states will maybe subvert the relief system by placing demands on individuals that are not realistic. Finally, my third point will be very brief, and that will be on the idea of exceptions to this discharge relief. It is, I understand, a very controversial topic. Which kinds of debts will be excluded from a discharge system? Which will receive 100%? And inevitably, some creditors will be very persuasive in getting their 100% promise. That is, of course, not to say that these creditors will ever be repaid. Their debt simply will not be discharged. And I have, again, a mild third concern about the degree to which certain debts are accepted from the discharge. So first of all, again, I'll begin with what I think is the most important question, and that is access. Article 19 of the proposal, at least as I have found it, says that member states have to ensure access to a system for over-indebted entrepreneurs. And that really is about the only guidance we're offered here, that member states shall ensure that over-indebted entrepreneurs have access to a discharge. Unless, Article 22 adds, they've acted dishonestly or in bad faith. And there's also a reference to abusive access to the system. And I read these words and I begin to wonder, how much variety will we continue to have among European member states if this is going to be the baseline rule? And my fear is that we will achieve almost no harmonization if member states are given this much latitude to decide, what does over-indebtedness mean? What is dishonesty? What is good faith? Very frequently in United States law, even in commercial law, the rule will say something like one of the sides can argue that it's unfair for a certain result to occur. And I tell my students that the argument then is to throw out the F word. And of course, they recoil in horror knowing what we generally call the F word in English. It's a quite vulgar word if you're not familiar. And of course, I mean fairness is the F word that I mean here. It's not a useful term for us. If we say that the rule is do whatever is fair, this is just the F word. You can do whatever you want to decide what fairness now means. And I'm concerned that, that both the entrance requirement, over-indebtedness, and these access restrictions, dishonesty and fairness, may well pose problems. So it's wonderful that we will finally have a baseline of having access for over-indebted entrepreneurs. I'm nervous about member states' ability to continue to define honesty and good faith abuse in a variety of ways that we have seen over the years. So for example, Denmark was the first country in continental Europe, first country in Europe entirely in 1984, to adopt a system allowing individual people, beating heart debtors, to receive relief by way of a discharge. As you can imagine, though, in 1984, Denmark was very nervous about this idea, and they wanted to limit the degree to which people would access this admittedly extraordinary relief. So they said, we're going to place an access restriction and say you can get into this hospital only if your over-indebtedness is clear. That is to say, it is entirely clear that within the foreseeable future, you will be unable to manage your debts in light of your relatively clear future income. The problem with phrasing this access requirement in this seemingly okay way was that the courts had a real struggle identifying whether it was going to be clear that particularly small and medium-sized entrepreneurs would be able to manage their debts in the future. If there's one thing that characterizes small and medium business, it is not clarity. Risk, uncertainty, unpredictability. These are things with which small business people live daily. And as a result, it was almost impossible for small business people to gain access to the relief system in Denmark for nearly its first entire 20 years. Oddly, this same rule prevented another group of people from accessing the system, and this is young people. Young people, you say, well, what could have prevented them? The answer is, of course, well, you're young. How can it be clear that over the remaining 50 years of your life, you'll be unable to manage your debts as they come due? Young people have vibrant, volatile lives. So you should wait until it becomes clear that you have no hope of regaining your potential to manage your debts. And I say, for heaven's sake, these are precisely the two groups for which insolvency and reinvigoration should be designed. If we are not mobilizing the energies of young people and small to medium-sized entrepreneurs, what use is having a hospital with a locked door? So finally, after 20 years of frustration with this problem, the Danish legislature responded, I think again quite admirably. In 2005, they launched a reform process, saying, we're not happy with this failure of ours to deal with the problems of young people and small entrepreneurs, so we will at least modify the entrance criteria to allow small business people in particular access if their future situation is unclear. Nonetheless, after 20 years of practice, path dependency, keeping people out of the system, the courts in Denmark continue to allow fewer than half of all applications for relief into their insolvency system, into their discharge system, to be admitted. Fewer than half. About 25% of Danish personal insolvency cases involve small to medium-sized entrepreneurs. This, keeping these people out of the hospital because their insolvency is not clear and devastating enough, is lost potential. This is lost competitiveness. It is an opportunity missed, and I'm afraid that even the harmonization process in the proposal will not prevent this kind of problem from recurring. Sweden agreed. Sweden also adopted one of the very early individual insolvency laws in 1994, but for exactly the same reasons as in Denmark, very few small, medium-sized entrepreneurs were allowed access to the Swedish restructuring, well, I shouldn't say restructuring, the discharge system in Sweden. And so once again, Swedish legislators, Swedish reformers saw this and were concerned. They were concerned about denying to small to medium-sized entrepreneurs, especially what they called the benefit of growth-promoting entrepreneurship. This is what we're trying to achieve, not repayment to creditors. We want growth-promoting entrepreneurship for society. So finally, the Swedes reacted. In November of last year, they adopted an entirely new system, further complicating what was an already complicated system with a new process called F-skuldsanering. F stands for företagare. This is small business insolvency in particular. And one question we might ask is, why do you need a separate system? Why don't you simply revise mildly your existing system as the Danes did? And the answer, going to my concern, is the Swedes were concerned that only serious small business people should be allowed into this new relief system of theirs, the F-skuldsanering. So serious business people were defined as those who had not behaved in an irresponsible way. And I say, here we go again. The F word. Irresponsible. And they offer examples. Well, irresponsible behavior from a small to medium-sized entrepreneur might be untidy bookkeeping, or failure to comply with tax obligations. And I say, good heavens, that's what leads every small business person into insolvency. So are you seriously going to continue for the next 20 years not allowing small business people into your personal insolvency system? And they say, well, maybe, but in addition, small business people can access the new F-skuldsanering only if they can also promise to pay 650 euros per quarter to their creditors. If you can't pay that much, then no relief for you. Once again, why do we continue to build hospitals and lock the doors? If these kinds of non-harmonious deviations from allowing people in are going to be allowed to persist, and I see no reason in the proposed directive that the Swedish and Danish systems are problematic, we will continue to see what we see in Sweden, and that is only around 60% of applications are approved. Once again, nearly half of the small business people who need relief from this system are not receiving it. Saying that over-indebted individuals should have access to a discharge is not helpful if access is defined in such a restrictive way. So I began to further think, how might a resistant member state like Bulgaria, for example, how might they respond then to a directive telling them you must allow people access to an insolvency system about whom you are very skeptical? How might Bulgaria draft a law that seems to comply with the proposed directive and yet prevents most people from coming in? It seems to me the answer is, look at Bulgaria's neighbors and their experience. Poland, for example, in 2009, adopted a personal insolvency system. They were quite proud of this system, announced it publicly and made great fanfare of it. From now on, those who have fallen into insolvency due to exceptional circumstances entirely beyond their control will be allowed entry into the hospital. In the next 2.5 years, over 2,000 people applied for admission to the hospital, of whom 60 were admitted. When 2.75% of your applicants are admitted into the hospital, you're going to remain with a lot of sick people. And once again, society is losing the benefits of those people's activities. If they're forced to remain ill, we will not treat you. We all lose. It's not simply the entrepreneurs who lose, and the creditors do not gain. The answer to barring people from the insolvency hospital is not, well, creditors will be repaid now. The answer is, the small entrepreneur will simply be immobilized and we will no longer enjoy her creative energies for all of our benefit. Luckily for us, Poland responded and said this 2.75% admissions rate has got to change. The new law as of the end of 2014 allows admission for individuals whose insolvency was not caused by their gross negligence. But once again, as any student of tort or delicts law understands, negligence can be defined in quite a wide variety of ways, not to mention gross negligence. The intention is good, but these wide variety of approaches to barring the door to the insolvency hospital are, I'm afraid, not going to be hindered by the directive, and we'll continue to see an incredible array of disparities among member state insolvency discharge system rules that completely subvert, that completely undermine the effectiveness of the system. Another of Bulgaria's neighbors, Hungary, took a relatively similar approach. I call this the Goldilocks approach. Goldilocks found porridge that was, some was too hot, some was too cold, chairs that were too hard, too soft. The Hungarian approach is the Goldilocks approach to insolvency. You'll be admitted into the Hungarian insolvency hospital only if you are not solvent, but not too insolvent. In other words, you have to have between 5,000 euros of debt and 150,000 euros of debt. Well, why is someone who has $160,000 of euro debt, why is that person ineligible for admission into the hospital? You're too sick. Well, what? I'm too sick. Oh, and it gets better. The person who has this sweet spot of indebtedness has to have available asset value and income over the next 5 years that is less than the value of all of his or her existing assets, but not less than half of that. So the math involved in calculating whether one is invited into the Hungarian system is so complex that I suspect it takes an accountant for this small business person to figure out, am I eligible for relief or am I not? The accountant then has to tell the small business person in Hungary, well, wait, there's one more thing. You're not allowed into the system if you are subject to a claim from outside Hungary. Talk about cross-border problems. You're not allowed in if you are subject to an enforcement proceeding right now by any creditor who's owed more than 500 euros. And you're not allowed into the system if you have any debt for fines or public law. What I'd like to know from Hungary is who does qualify to get into this hospital? I don't understand, once again, how anyone thought that this could possibly be an effective system, and yet, once again, when they have on paper a system that seems to allow access and recovery to small to medium-sized businesses, I think places like Hungary can honestly tell the Commission, we've complied with your directive. We have a system that, ensures entrepreneurs who are over-indebted, as we define that term, access to relief. But it doesn't do a lot of people much good if you define it in that way. All right, there are a variety of other access restrictions that I could talk about at length. I will try to move on then to my next topic, though, because this is such a problem. I think enough said, other than, well, what's your solution, Kilborn? I mean, if this is such a problem, well, then how should the Commission proceed? And I think one easy way of answering the question is to simply change the way in which certain debtors are excluded from access. If you're concerned, as I think European legislators rightly are, about abuse, then offer a presumption of good faith and a presumption of entitlement to relief to everyone to begin with. Assume that people have acted in good faith, but allow creditors, if they really care about this, to point out that the debtor has acted in bad faith or is otherwise not eligible for entry into the system. Forcing people to put their money where their mouth is and actually pay to challenge the debtor's access to this system would be much more successful and I think efficient than forcing every single debtor to establish his or her good faith or his or her honesty or his or her over-indebtedness using whatever complicated accounting principles the process requires. All right, so problem number one, access. I'm most concerned that member states who want to avoid the proposed directive's requirements will simply define the access criteria very, very narrowly. Concern number two goes back again to Article 19, and again, very, very commendable how the article is focused, and Andre pointed this out. It says, for those member states, which includes most of Europe today, where the discharge is conditioned on partial repayment of debt, that repayment obligation should be based on the debtor's disposable income, which has to be, where the payment amount required has to be notably proportionate to the debtor's disposable income over this 3-year discharge period. Wonderful, once again, first step. I really commend this in order in particular to get over the requirements in places like the Czech Republic and Austria of requiring of every individual debtor a minimum amount of payment. If my debts are, $100,000, 30% of that is a lot of money. If my debts are $1 million, that's really a lot of money. And quite a lot of personal insolvency cases in Austria in particular and the Czech Republic have been denied. There's no reason to prevent this poor gentleman whom Andrej described from receiving the relief that really the society needs for this person to relieve. We want to reinvigorate people who at least were productive at one time, save them from their not necessarily their own sins, but save them from the volatility of our modern economy and get them back moving again. We need to stop crying over spilt milk. And once again, I really commend the idea of making sure that the payment obligation imposed on people for discharge is commensurate with their actual ability. This is great. What's not so great, perhaps, is that key question. How do we define what disposable income is? How do we define the debtor's ability to pay is not addressed at all in the proposal. And the approaches to this problem, to this question, have been very, very different and have caused a lot of problems across Europe. One big problem is when states have left this to the discretion of a court or to an agency of some kind. If you put individual people in charge of this decision, you will have massive amounts of disparity, unevenness, what I think I frankly would call unfairness, using the F word myself. So allowing individual system administrators to make decisions of what a reasonable lifestyle looks like for an individual debtor is not a useful way of going about this. Many, many people have been denied relief, at least practically, because individual judges and administrators have defined a reasonable lifestyle in a way that is unlivable. Particularly over the long-term repayment plans that are involved in these systems. Even 3 years, even if it's manageable, is a very long time. Spain, it seems to me, has taken a more or less commendable approach to this problem by defining the debtor's repayment capacity in terms of the general rules that would ordinarily apply to a collections action. The general income exemptions are defined as the baseline for what individual debtors ought to be able to retain. Anything in advance of that, in excess of that, would be disposable. I immediately, though, thought of the experience of Germany, which also began in the 1990s with that same approach, and said, well, we'll define disposable income in a relatively harmonious and uniform way. And we'll say the income exemption, which we've defined by law for all debtors, will be the amount by which this disposable income is calculated. Germany, though, faced a couple of problems there. The first of which is that these income exemptions had not been indexed for inflation in 10, 15 years. And as a result, though the number that was listed as the baseline for disposable income was uniform, it was completely unlivable. Many people were unable to survive on the amount of income that these general income exemptions allowed them, and particularly over the next 3 or 5 or 6, or as it was in Germany, 7 years of a payment plan in this way. And they weren't indexed in a way that was sensitive enough to the individual needs of individual debtors. Once again, I commend the Commission's proposal for focusing on proportionality to the individual debtor's situation. An individualized approach is much more effective than a baseline, even if it is uniform, that doesn't quite fit individual people. If you have a shoe store, to use another metaphor, with only 5 sizes of shoes, I can probably find a size of shoes that's close enough to the debtor, but it would be much better to have shoes that actually fit if we're trying to achieve something for individualized relief. France also had this problem very early on, approached the idea of offering individuals relief from their debts, and started with the idea that general income exemptions would be the baseline measurement for what should we expect people to pay. Anything in excess of these general income limitations would be, as France said, the starting point. French legislators understood after about 10 years of experience with this that this is a very sensitive process, and individualized tailoring of these exemptions limits should be regarded as one part of the resources, only one part of the resources necessary to support a reasonable lifestyle. Some degree of flexibility is desirable, but complete lack of harmony, lack of uniformity is not desirable, as system administrators in, again, both Sweden and Denmark discovered in applying their approach to this disposable income question for individuals. In Sweden, once again, the idea of what is disposable income was initially suggested to be guided by the general income exemption limit, and eventually, to make things easier for themselves, the Swedish administrators of this system adopted the general income exemption guidelines, very much like the Spanish approach, it seems. I could very well be wrong about this. But once again, in Sweden's case, the system administrators understood that individualized tailoring a bit is necessary to make a realistic requirement of what this person really can pay. So virtually every approach to the debtor's budget in Sweden includes a buffer for unforeseen expenses, individualized, tailored to the situation of that individual debtor. We need to treat people like people, not like numbers or widgets that can be perfectly uniform, while at the same time making sure that they can lead a life that is consistent with human dignity. In Denmark, this is one of my favorite stories. In Denmark, the income exemption guidelines were, I don't think, existed at the time when the original law was adopted. And so they were left with the problem that I mentioned a minute ago. The courts were in charge of deciding what a modest lifestyle looked like for individual debtors. As a result, as any lawyer could anticipate, different judges had very different perspectives on what a modest lifestyle is, so much so that debtors who lived in a district headed by a judge who was known to be particularly demanding would frequently move house to another district in Denmark before filing insolvency. Right? This is one of these, I think they call it insolvency tourism issues, though within one's own country. We would call this a staycation, I guess. This is obviously silly. Giving people an incentive to move house across country simply so they can get manageable relief is not something that I would think, certainly the Commission wouldn't welcome, but I would hope national legislatures don't welcome this kind of thing either. We're trying to achieve something that will work for everybody, and I really hope that national legislators, even if the Commission's directive comes down offering lots of leeway, I would hope national legislators learn from each other's mistakes and say, gosh, I don't want to have happen what happened in Denmark. Let's see what the right solution might be. And my closing comment on that point then is I think the right solution is offered to us by Ireland, which took a very, very sensitive approach to its disposable income calculation by adopting very tailored guidelines for what reasonable living expenses means. And they identified these reasonable living expenses in consultation with a huge variety of sources, including what I thought was really fabulous, that they did these focus groups with individual people randomly selected from the Irish population. And they asked these people, tell us what you think a reasonable budget would be for an Irish person living a reasonable life. We don't want you, they said, we don't want you to tell us what you think a minimum survival standard is. And we don't want you to tell us what do you think someone on the edge of poverty should be living like. Our question is, what does it look like to have a standard of living to allow people to engage in activities that are normal for Irish society? We want to encourage people to live a normal life, to be rehabilitated, and to be welcomed back into the productive flock of Irish small business people and Irish consumers also, who are driving our economy and our competitiveness forward. This is a great approach. I understand that the Commission only has so much leeway to sort of impose approaches on individual member states. But again, second, this idea of saying that the repayment capacity of the debtor should be gauged by that person's reasonable income or disposable income isn't really a standard. It allows way too much leeway for member states who want to deviate from the desired approach, and I'm afraid that's what we're going to see. One last comment on this point of the very basic idea of expecting entrepreneurs, in particular, to spend 3 years turning over their disposable income, the very idea of putting in particular young people and small entrepreneurs in this 3-year repayment plan is a little bit more problematic than I think many people would acknowledge. On the one hand, we kind of would like creditors to be repaid something if the individual has capacity to pay. I appreciate that. On the other hand, if the debtors are small business people and young people, probably the principal purpose of individual discharge today is not repayment of creditors, it is reinvigoration of these people for the benefit of society. And I was thinking about this as I read a recent empirical study of Dutch individual entrepreneurs in the Dutch personal rehabilitation program, the VSNP, and a couple of comments really caught my attention. One of the small entrepreneurs who was interviewed was complaining that during this 3-year repayment period, he was not allowed to start up anything new. He was not allowed to access his creative energies for the benefit of himself and society, but he says, but I'm constantly thinking about it. This person's productive energies were being intentionally suppressed by the insolvency relief system. This is, I think, not what we would really rather have for an insolvency system that's designed to get people reinvigorated, and it's keeping them down. I'm constantly thinking about it, he says, but I can't offer those benefits to myself or society during this 3-year period. And another in particular said something very disturbing. This person observed that she could cope with the 3-year repayment period, agreeing with Andre that this is possible. I can do this, but she said, but the idealism had gone. The idealism had gone. I mean, it brings tears to your eyes. This person was a productive person, really contributing to society in exactly the way that we need to maximize European competitiveness, and that 3-year discharge period sucked the idealism out of her. This is precisely not what we want an insolvency system to be doing. We want it to reinvigorate the energies of small business people. We don't want to have these missed opportunities and suppressed energies during the 3-year period and perhaps even after that 3-year period. One more quick comment then about my last point, and that is I'm a bit concerned about exceptions to discharge. Andre pointed out that there is a small section, Article 22, that says the discharge need not encompass all debts. It can have exceptions. And I said, understandable. The only 2 exceptions that I saw there, though, were for criminal penalties and tortious liability. Criminal penalties made perfect sense to me. This is an exception that one sees in virtually every insolvency system around the world, and I understand we don't want people to be evading their obligations to pay a criminal penalty. Family support obligations are also quite frequently accepted, though I don't think that appears in the proposed directive. The odd thing is this tortious liability point. I was an outside advisor to the Leeds study that supported the Commission's proposal, and I commented on this several times, and I asked the drafters of the Leeds study, where are you getting this idea that there is a broad agreement that some sort of liability for tort obligations should be accepted from discharge? I never got a straight answer from these people, and yet here we now see it again. I don't know where this comes from, that the idea that tort rather than contract should be excluded from discharge. Where does this come from? This is an extreme deviation from standard practice and certainly from best practice. Whether you're held down as a small entrepreneur because you can't pay back your bank loan or because you can't pay an exorbitantly large judgment against you from someone who was injured by your negligence, it's the same idea. I'm still carrying a burden from which I need to be relieved. I don't understand why this tortious liability is mentioned there at all, and I hope that eventually it goes away. One thing that isn't mentioned, that's a very, very sensitive topic, and this will be my last comment, is tax obligations. Debts to the state raise very, very sensitive and difficult issues. On the one hand, it is quite frequent, and my own country is an example of this. It is quite frequent for tax obligations to be not dischargeable under virtually any circumstance. And I understand this because this is an obligation to the state, and if we're trying to reinvigorate people for the benefit of the state, you've sort of got to pay your obligations to the state. This is an agreement with all of society. On the other hand, if the state expects private creditors to forgo their rights to collect against the debtor, the state should probably lead by example and agree to do that as well. I release you, debtor, just as I require all of your private creditors to release you. I, the state, will also contribute to your reinvigoration for the benefit of us all. And once again, I just cannot commend the Commission enough, and I'm so excited to see this great movement in Europe toward reinvigorating everyone and getting all of the member states on board with a system that provides this reinvigorating discharge to everybody. Thanks very much for having me.
Great. Congratulations. Muchísimas gracias, profesor Kilborn, por magnífica presentación. Yo creo que muy clara y además haciendo uso de esa habilidad que tiene de manejar el derecho comparado, pues ir punto por las cuestiones clave de la propuesta de directiva e intentar desmontar alguna de las cuestiones sobre la base de la experiencia que ha habido en otros ordenamientos. Yo creo que este es un planteamiento pues muy adecuado. Muchísimas gracias, profesor. El profesor Tirado creo que tiene una pregunta.
Si hay alguien más, lo dejo porque ya hablo antes.
¿Alguien quería preguntar algo? Habla tú por el momento y luego ya...
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for asking in English.
Yeah. My Spanish is very good if you want.
No, mine is not.
Thank you for your passionate... let me put together a couple of words to help out perhaps the Commission and Andrei. Their job is extremely difficult, and perhaps just drawing from my own experience, I have done a lot of work, many weeks of my life, if not months, in places like Kyrgyz, Kazakhstan, Romania, Poland, Kosovo, Albania. Why am I mentioning these countries in particular? Because they all come from the Eastern European legal tradition. And when it comes to insolvency, of course, they have no tradition at all. And they are extremely worried about honesty and about misbehavior. They are all convinced, absolutely, that if you open up the door of the hospital, you're going to have buses of people just crowding into the hospital, and you're going to clog the hospital, and everyone's going to die when they're in there. And the country itself is going to die because the whole thing is going to be paralyzed. So very often, through the IMF, the World Bank, or whoever, or just the European Commission, UNCITRAL, at a given point, you can help convince the Ministry of Finance, and especially the central banks of these countries, to incorporate a legislation that allows for a discharge of individuals. But of course, they are so concerned with honesty issues that they try to close the door to the extent that they can. And most of these laws are the result of a compromise. So while I sympathize with your general abstract analysis of it, saying this is too narrow, certainly, but this is as far as they're willing to go, for the time being at least. So I can only imagine how difficult it must be for Andrei and to have, a Romanian representative, a Polish representative, and because they are convinced that if you apply this, non-payment culture will kick in even stronger in their countries, and it's not going to destroy the banking system, which usually is already damaged enough in those countries. And a couple of points very quickly on concepts like gross negligence, good faith in continental European systems are quite ring-fenced and defined. So this is not too open. When you talk about good faith is something that every country has more or less defined, at least through its jurisprudence. So it's not a closed matter. It's not an open matter. It's a very let's say common concept to use. And finally, in the case of Spain, disposable wages, exempt property is defined with regard to the minimum wage. The minimum wage is updated every year. So we don't have the German problem, and I would think most countries in Europe will do the same. They will just tag the definition onto the minimum wage, which is updated in the budget every year, right? Okay, so the problem is not so strong there.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond briefly on that last point, I don't really know. I also would have expected a very well-structured, very level-headed jurisdiction like Germany to have had indexed protections like this, and the fact that they didn't was a real surprise to me. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if a number of these Eastern European countries in particular, given how concerned they are, would really subject some debtors to a very, very grinding poverty level of subsistence living. Not so much to maximize benefits to creditors, but to avoid this abuse. You know, they'll say only people who are really serious about engaging with their obligations are going to be allowed in here, because this kind of penury to which we will subject them is the cost of the benefit that we'll offer. And that will ensure that only very serious and honest people will get in. I mean, again, it's one approach, but I mean, it's something that I'm afraid we should anticipate. I mean, if the rule is going to be member states shall ensure that over-indebted people have access to a full discharge, period, that leaves an enormous amount of leeway for countries to decide, you know, what exactly is the access restriction? Well, it's you've got to really prove that you deserve and want this, and that's going to exclude enormous groups of people who otherwise would contribute greatly to society's benefit, and I am mildly concerned about that.
Okay, yeah, of course.
May I maybe react to some of the points?
By all means.
which were made. Jason, I would love to have you in the European Parliament to discuss. We'll invite you as soon as will be possible, because this is exactly the time of persuasiveness, both on the substance as well as the way you did it, that we need in the European debate. And
I'll be on a flight tomorrow, anytime.
Second thing, on the theoretical, economical argument, I completely buy it. If it were on me, I like the US system, which is done. You dispose of your assets, you go for 6 months for sort of anonymous, I don't say alcoholic, but bankruptcy, bankrupt guy's treatment after six months, where you're basically learning how to maybe better manage your financial stuff. You're released and you can start again. I would love to have it, because if we go on the economic, if in the US, even in the US, this means, this 6 months, that you can probably go bankrupt 10 times in your career, which means you can try 10 times in your life, slightly. In case you have this indeterminate, I would say debt slavery, which is in Europe somewhere, you can try once in your life. Then now just multiply the amount of persons by the amount of chances, and you see why the European economy is behind the US economy. Mm-hmm. Because if you multiply the amount of people who can do something by 10 chances, you get enormous amount of opportunities. If you multiply the amount of people in Europe times 1 or times 2 or times 3, that's the real difference between the competitiveness of US and Europe in this sense. Now, practically, we have for this part on discharge, we have absolute no from 3 countries, relatively small ones, some of the mentions which have the harshest system, which to us is a bit of a success, because they don't do the qualified majority, and we will probably able to overcome that. On the other hand, in general, now the directive goes to the general GHA Council for the ministries for the policy questions. And the main thing is the Commission proposal is too restrictive for us. We want more flexibility, and that will be approach of the Council. On some of the small point things, we didn't put the maintenance obligations. It's difficult to define, and we didn't want to spend years. There would be years of discussion whether we write maintenance, whether it's family, it's children, and etc. Most of them member states will put it there. The tortious criminal, it's what Ignacio said. It's basically obligation if you commit a criminal act, or obligation if you cause of administrative misdemeanor, which is quite well defined. Sort of, if it's under Czech law criminal act, it's a theft. If you steal something above certain amount, it's only administrative offense. If you steal something which is of a lower amount, we want to cover that. That's basically. But in English, you have to call it a tortious.
Is that so?
It's this, and you know, also some other wrongdoing. But in principle, this is to capture this is to capture, the biggest mistake. The thing is, in English, you can't define it as administrative law violations or that kind of thing. But this is the minimum which is there. The tortious can go slightly more, but this is the core. Sorry, I was.
So thank you very much. That's really interesting.
So it's not. I thought it was related to the fact that the one who suffers a tort damage hasn't assumed the risk is the classical explanation for providing a priority to the one who has a tort claim. Is the same idea. So you ran me over with the car. I didn't bargain for it. I didn't assume the risk, so I should not be exempt. I mean, I should be repaid anyway. That would be the idea.
Well, I understand, obviously, the philosophical idea behind accepting or offering priority to tort claims, which makes perfect sense, I think, in the business restructuring context. Right? If the idea is we're pretty sure that significant creditors will be repaid, then let's figure out who gets repaid. That's really not the driving idea. And this is, I think, my most important point here. The driving idea is, as I tried really hard in the first chapter of the World Bank report on the treatment of insolvency of natural persons, I tried to emphasize that the purpose of this system is only about this much now. Repayment of creditors. It only depends about this much now on whether they were adjusting creditors or assuming the risk or anything. It's about reinvigoration of debtors' energies for all of our benefit. This is about society's concerns, not about the concerns of an individual creditor. So again, I can certainly understand accepting a tort liability from discharge, but it undermines the system in a way that doesn't make as much sense to me, though it does make sense now if we define this as being essentially administrative penalties. Now we're speaking the same language. And I'm really surprised that the Commission chooses to use the word tortious liability, which is very broad, rather than simply saying administrative penalties, if that's what you mean. So really, really interesting. I mean, I appreciate your having pointed that out. It's a really, really interesting perspective.
Martin. Yeah, just a very small comment, actually. I just wanted to challenge your comparison and metaphor with the hospital. I think one metaphor would be much more appropriate to understand how people think about this, and this goes back to the debates we were having about human nature. I think they take insolvency just like prison sentences. It has been very well documented that if prisoners spend a lot of time in prisons and there's no rehabilitation programs or anything like a job training or whatever, their odds of committing worse crimes when they go out are actually higher. But for some reason in our society, we want them to suffer. We want them to be punished for what they've done. And so actually it costs society more when they go out of prison if they don't undergo these kind of, job trainings and support and whatever, because for some reason as society we don't want them to escape their responsibility for committing a heinous. And it's kind of, I think that's the same way we're thinking about insolvency. What you're proposing, it's almost like saying, well, you can escape your responsibilities. Yeah. Well, it's not really that. It's actually, we're all suffering more, is that what you're saying, from the fact that we keep those people in over-indebtedness continuously. But for some reason, psychologically, for the human people, it's very hard to say, let's help them, It's just like, prisoners, let's give them some training so they can, get a job when they get out, so they don't have to go back into drug dealing or stealing,
Mm-hmm. That's just, this is precisely why I use the metaphor of the hospital rather than the prison, because I agree with you entirely. Particularly in Europe, it really does seem that most people think that an insolvency relief system should be about prison, and particularly in countries where the very word for debt is the same as the word for sin. Schuld, right? Schuld, Skulden. I mean, there's a deep psychological connection between you've sinned and must atone. And I think words matter. If we start talking about this in terms of hospitals and rehabilitation and recovery and reinvigoration, I think we're going to make some progress. So thanks for the comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have a lot of time, but I want to ask you something.
Okay.
A little fast. Well, you are in favor of a generous system. I agree with you. But in the proposal, what do you think about the possibly discrimination between consumer and entrepreneurs? Because the proposal allows that entrepreneurs can get the debt relief of domestic debts. And otherwise, the other consumers can't obtain the the domestic, the relief of domestic debt? What do you think about it?
So I think it's a real problem, both practically and theoretically. Practically, it will be, I think, very challenging for member states to distinguish who is a business person and who is a consumer, given that lots of people will have both kinds of liabilities. And in fact, you can easily imagine a sort of insolvency tourism developing where companies will, engage in some small business transaction with individuals, establishing debts that are business related now. And then they'll say, well, maybe that's sufficient business-related debt to allow you to engage somehow the business insolvency discharge system in your member state, even if you really aren't otherwise a business person. I suspect that many member states will limit this kind of relief only to people who are registered traders or something like that, very restrictively defining, again, who gets into the hospital. So theoretically, I agree with you entirely. This also is a pretty serious problem. In that both small entrepreneurs and consumers are contributing to economic competitiveness in a very real way. Consumers, as the Commission's, the travaux préparatoires point out, they are the driving force behind our economy. And so keeping large numbers of consumers immobilized creates very many of the same problems that keeping small entrepreneurs immobilized causes. And offering relief to one group while denying it to the other, I agree with you entirely, is a very serious problem. But taking off my academic hat and putting on my realist hat, as educated by Andrea and others, the fact of the matter is this is a very sensitive political question. And I understand perfectly well that particularly many Eastern European countries, and not only those, are very resistant to offering relief from legitimate debt to any group of people. And so if we can begin to get our foot in the door by getting countries to acknowledge that offering small entrepreneurs relief makes sense and begin to craft the contours of that kind of an approach, eventually we'll begin to develop the path that will lead to path dependency, and eventually member states will come on their own to the idea that, well, we've been offering small individual business people this kind of relief for some time. Why not just extend it to consumers as well? And we've got to attack this on a number of fronts politically. Politically, it's great, again, that the Commission is encouraging member states to, first of all, follow a directive in cleaning up their business discharge rules, but also encouraging member states to apply that same approach to consumer matters. On that front, I think that's very powerful. But there's another important front, and that's essentially peer pressure. When member states see each other doing the right thing in their personal insolvency systems, and they hear about conferences like this, where passionate people get up there and say, this is exactly the right way to do things. This is going to create the business productivity and the engagement that European society really needs. We are going to be influencing national legislatures as well. And fighting this fight on both of those fronts, we've made great progress over the past 3 decades. In 1983, an individual could get relief in exactly 0 places in the European Union. In 2017, an individual can get relief of one kind or another almost everywhere. This is massive progress without the intervention of the Commission. So I think with the intervention of the Commission, setting sort of a norm, an informal norm of this is the right way to go, and having more conferences like this in public conversation where we talk about hospitals rather than prisons, I really think we can make some progress in influencing the way people think about giving relief to both groups.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.